those who participated already yesterday, and so we are having the second regional policy dialogue on environmental sustainability under the theme of enhancing climate finance and promoting technological transfers. So we started yesterday with the focus on policy framework and the need for aligning policies and policy instruments for net zero carbon economy. And we also discussed carbon pricing and fossil fuel subsidies as part of the aligned fiscal agenda for achieving climate mitigation goals. So we are ready now to move to another topic. But for those who don't know me, I just want to introduce myself. My name is Eija Kiskinen, and I'm the senior global relations advisor in the Environment Directorate. So nice to meet you all. And so, in fact, I want to just to briefly tell you, I'm waiting that maybe we will have more people joining, talking a little bit more here. We have now 40 people I see online. So I just want to note that this is our second regional policy dialogue as part of our new project at the OECD, Enhancing Green Transition in Latin America and Caribbean, from commitments to action. And it is carried out under the new environmental sustainability priority of the OECD Latin America and Caribbean Regional Program. So today's session will focus on climate finance, and we will be looking at international perspective of the climate finance, which is the session 2, which we are starting now in a minute. And we are also looking mobilization of the private climate finance and at the session 3. And then in the end, we will have a short session where Rodolfo LAC, OECD Director for Climate Action and Environment for Latin America, and a special envoy on climate matters to the United Nations, will wrap up the day with the key messages from today's discussion. And just quickly to repeat some housekeeping rules. You saw the slides, but maybe just to remind you, and as you are possibly aware, there is a simultaneous interpretation in English and Spanish. So you just please click on the interpretation button, which is on the bottom of your screen, and select your preferred language. I would also like to invite everyone to keep the microphones always muted and only switch them on once you have been given the floor. You may leave your camera on if you wish so, or if your internet connection allows you. And we would appreciate if panelists for each session to have their cameras on when presenting. What else? I think, yeah, one thing I wanted just to say also that please raise your hand using the raise hand function on Zoom. In fact, we would hope you to actively use this raise hand function when we have the discussion, because yesterday, I think we didn't manage to have a proper discussion. So we hope that you will today be more active and raise the hand when we have discussion session. And now I would like to invite Rafael Yashnik, policy analyst on finance for climate action from the Environment, Transitions and Resilience Division of the OECD Environment Directorate. Rafael will moderate the session. So the floor is yours, Rafael.
Thank you, Eija. Can you hear and see me well? Great. Hello, everyone. Hola. So my name is Rafael. It's a pleasure to be with you today. As Eija briefly introduced, and apologies for my voice. I'm recovering from a small illness last week, so the voice might not be perfectly in tune, but should be okay. So I do work indeed in the Environment Directorate, where I lead work to track and assess finance for climate action, both in relation to climate finance provided and mobilized for developing countries, which I think is on topic for today, but also to the broader question of the consistency of financial flows and stocks with the Paris Agreement goals more generally. Now, the first session of the second day of the Regional Policy Dialogue, which I have the pleasure to moderate, is entitled Climate Finance in Latin America and the Caribbean from an International Perspective. As we all know, developed countries have committed under the UNFCCC to mobilize finance for climate action in developing countries. So on this, to open the session, we will shortly benefit from a quick presentation of latest OECD analysis and findings in that regard. But from a developing country perspective, I think what we need to keep in mind is that many countries also highlight, including in their nationally determined contributions, that they indeed require support in order to be able to implement their intended actions to mitigate and adapt to climate change. So in this context, the grouping of, if I'm not mistaken, over 30 countries within the Latin America and Caribbean region is far from being uniform. It contains a variety of middle-income countries with, for some of them, relatively conducive, enabling environment for investments and some capacity to absorb financing for, let's say, large-scale climate mitigation infrastructure projects. But at the same time, the region also includes, again, if I'm not mistaken, as many as 14 so-called small island and developing states, or SIDS, many of which are characterized by high exposure and vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. So as such, any discussion, such as the one we're going to have today, of the characteristics of and the needs from international climate finance, any such discussion needs to be nuanced and differentiated to account for these very different local contexts within the region. So in order to unpack these differences and specificities, as well as discuss how to promote a better matching between finance provided and mobilized on the one hand, and the type of finance needed on the other hand within the region, we have a great and expert panel with us today. First, Ms. Amanda McKee, who is Knowledge and Learning Director at the NDC Partnership. Amanda oversees the development of knowledge products and learning activities to support the implementation of NDCs, the raising of ambition of efforts across the partnership members and beyond. And she also brings previous work experience with the Green Growth Knowledge Platform, the World Trade Organization, and the UN's International Trade Center. As a second distinguished expert today, we have Ms. Sandra Guzman, who's the founder and general coordinator of the Climate Finance Group for Latin America and the Caribbean, GFLAC in short. GFLAC is an initiative by a group of civil society organizations and academic institutions that notably aims to promote transparency, accountability, and social participation in the climate finance architecture to ensure the effectiveness of international and national climate finance management. So right on topic for today as well. And in this context, Sandra brings a wealth of practical experience relating to climate finance tracking, assessment, and implementation. And third, but not least, we have our colleague from the OECD, Sebastian Nieto-Parra, who's the head of the Latin America and Caribbean unit at the OECD Development Center. And Sebastian leads the annual flagship Latin America Economic Outlook, as well as revenue statistics in Latin America and the region, in the Caribbean region, as well as the OECD multidimensional country reviews within the region again. So he brings also prior experience from the banking sector in Spain, as well as financial regulation in Colombia. So again, three very expert representatives here to help us unpack the discussion. But before turning to our panelists, and in order to set the stage for our discussion today, I would like to ask our colleagues from the OECD Secretariat to show us a brief video that my colleague Chiara Falturo has recorded, which in a couple of minutes summarizes at a pretty aggregate level the most recent findings from OECD analysis of climate finance provided and mobilized, with a bit of a zoom on the Latin American region. And I'll take it from there once we've collectively had a look at the short video.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. I am Chiara Falduto, a policy analyst at the OECD Environment Directorate. Today, I will be giving a presentation on OECD work on climate finance. So before we start, to provide some context, back in 2009 at COP15, developed countries have committed to a goal of jointly mobilizing $100 billion per year by 2020 to support climate action in developing countries. In 2015 at COP21, this goal has been extended to 2025. Since 2015, the OECD has been tasked by donor countries to measure progress towards this goal. And in the last 7 years, we have produced a series of reports towards this aim. Our latest analysis was released this year and provides data up to 2020, which is the latest year for which information on climate finance provided and mobilized is available, and also the initial year of the goal. So in this presentation today, I will be sharing with you key findings from our analysis, and I will focus specifically on the LAC region. Before we go straight into the numbers, I'll spend a few words on the data and methodologies that we use to track climate finance. We identify 4 different components of climate finance: bilateral public, multilateral public, export credits, and mobilized private. Each one of these components is based on activity level data, which is reported by donor countries via official processes. Each one of the components uses a different source. So for bilateral public, we use biannual reports to UNFCCC. For multilateral public and mobilized private, we use OECD DAC statistics. And for export credits, OECD export credit group statistics. All of these are publicly available. Very importantly, the OECD only accounts for climate finance that developed countries provide or mobilize, which means that we only capture the share of multilateral public and mobilized private climate finance that can be attributed to developed countries. Our accounting framework is consistent with the outcome of COP24 on finding sources and financial instruments. Now, looking at our main findings, so we see that in 2020, 83.3 billion were provided and mobilized for climate. Although this is a slight increase compared to 2019, it is still nearly $18 billion short of the 100 billion goal. We can see that compared to 2019, the increase in 2020 was mainly driven by public climate finance, bilateral public and multilateral public specifically. Export credits represented a relatively small share of total climate finance throughout the years. And mobilized private, which had initially been increasing since 2018, has been slowly decreasing, reaching 13.1 billion in 2020. We also tried to look at the different characteristics of climate finance, and in terms of climate theme, we found that mitigation finance remained the majority at 67%. However, climate finance targeting adaptation has been slowly increasing throughout the years. In terms of public finance instrument, loans represented 72% of total climate finance provided, and grants accounted for only about 1/4. However, similarly to adaptation, also the share of grants has been increasing through the years. In terms of recipient country income group, we see that lower middle income countries and upper middle income countries together account for more than half of total climate finance provided and mobilized. And finance for lower income countries and low income countries remained relatively small at 8%. Very similar trends can be observed for the LAC region. We found that between 2016 and 2020, 12.5 billion were provided and mobilized for this region, which is about 17% of the total. 74% of climate finance for LAC focused on mitigation. 80% of public finance was provided through loans, and the main targeted sector was the energy sector at 25%, followed by transport 11% and water supply and sanitation 10.5%. So I have already reached the end of my presentation, and I have only focused on the aggregate levels of climate finance. However, in our latest report, which was released just in September of this year, we provide more disaggregated analysis and insights that relate to the distribution and concentration of climate finance across climate themes, sector financial instruments, and more. In the report, we also explore questions that relate to the impact and effectiveness of climate finance. So I invite you to have a look at our latest publication. And this report and all the others can be accessed through our website. And here I am providing a short link that you can use to find our work. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of your session.
Great. So that worked perfectly well. That's fantastic. The idea of having this short presentation was really to set the stage. As Chiara indicated, the presentation remained at a very aggregate level. I think referring back to some of the opening remarks I made, there is obviously a need to unpack these very aggregate trends and look at what they mean when you look at the local context of different countries and within the Latin American region. That's really what I think our panel discussion aims to do. So, take as a starting point what Chiara just presented, but move beyond that to actually consider differentiated sort of like needs and characteristics and how these can be best addressed. So with that in mind, I think we have 3 main discussion questions that perhaps my colleagues can bring on the screen for everybody to have in mind. The first one is, how can countries better quantify and align their climate action needs with the finance provided? Reading them in English, we have them in Spanish on the slide, that's perfect. Second, what do LAC countries need in order to improve absorption capacity of climate finance? I think, as I mentioned already, some countries may have relatively higher capacities than others already, but there's a general need to enhance capacity to seek and absorb climate finance. And would capacity development on budgeting and on assessing the cost of climate action be under consideration? Third, which type of climate finance would best fit the needs of LAC countries? So again, this question of matching the characteristics of international climate finance provided and mobilized with what is actually needed by the countries within the region. So with these questions in mind, let me now move to our panelists. Each of them will be given, one after another, the opportunity to make a first overview intervention to address these questions and perhaps other points they'd like to make. While they do so, I really invite our audience, as I think Eya already mentioned at the beginning, to already think about questions that they would like to ask our panelists or further issues that they would like to raise and see discussed. We will turn to you, the audience, after our panelists have intervened. But for now, let me first invite Amanda McKee, who I presented earlier on, from the NDC partnership, to take the floor and make her, let's say, first overview intervention to address the topics of the day. Amanda, if you're with us, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Raphael, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. So I'm with the NDC partnership, and so I want to start by framing my intervention within the context of the NDCs. And NDCs are really the cornerstone of global climate action, reflecting national commitments from both developed and developing countries towards the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals. And so where effectively aligned with national and sectoral development strategies and priorities, they can constitute a really powerful starting point for translating countries' climate commitments into investment actions. And as countries move to implement their ambitious climate commitments, it's clear that more resources and support to access these resources will be needed. So we've seen through the NDC partnership, countries have really raised the bar during the last NDC revision cycle. And now their commitments, these ambitious commitments, need to be met with equally ambitious support for their implementation. And that includes widespread resource mobilization. So it should not come as a surprise that finance is actually the most frequently requested topic of support that we receive from countries through the partnership, with requests ranging from support for creating an enabling environment all the way to developing bankable projects. From the NDC partnership's engagement with over 80 developing countries, 24 of which are in the LAC region, we're really seeing firsthand the challenges and the frustrations that countries face as they try to finance climate commitments. So to support these needs, we launched our finance strategy earlier this year to really better support members by building up national and subnational capacity, as well as enabling environments, translating NDCs into strong national investment strategies and project pipelines, engaging with relevant stakeholders for resource mobilization, and by identifying, developing, and sharing potential investment opportunities in member countries. So the NDC partnership is built on this premise of collective action. So by acting together, we can achieve more. So in the LAC region, to put this challenge into perspective, according to the IDB, the annual cost by 2030 of NDC implementation in the region is estimated to be as much as 8% of GDP for infrastructure and up to 11% of GDP to address some of the social challenges. And so we know that the challenge is large, but mobilizing the finance needed to achieve this transformational change is going to require more than just money. There needs to be the ability to attract it, the ability to absorb it, and this will really require aligning processes, simplifying requirements to access funds, building in-country capacity, strengthening coordination with finance providers, and much more. So the NDC partnership is really working at the intersection of these needs. So working with countries to build the enabling environments and the capacity, and working with financiers to help them to understand where the country needs are, helping them to simplify or to streamline requirements, and then really working to bridge that gap between those two groups, specifically through the development of specific capacity building programs, also through the development of investment plans, which can help bring all of that together. So I want to end by just highlighting a couple of examples on some of the ways that we're supporting countries to strengthen their abilities to access finance. The first is really focused on the post-COVID recovery period, where we deployed several economic advisors to support governments in preparing climate-compatible recovery packages. And these advisors were embedded directly in ministries of finance and planning to prepare national plans, develop project pipelines, concepts, and mobilize climate finance. And we deployed advisors in 10 countries in the LAC region. So one example is in Colombia, where the advisor helped to develop a sustainable recovery strategy, including over 40 recommendations on infrastructure, bioeconomy, and nature-based solutions. Another example that I wanted to give is this past year, we've really expanded this work to support for central banks and financial supervisors in greening the financial sector. So helping to engage the financial sector in mitigating climate-related risks and helping them to catalyze opportunities to transition to a low carbon and resilient economy. So an example here is the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank, which oversees 8 countries in the Caribbean, is receiving support through this initiative from AFD and from the World Bank to green their financial system in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union. And so specifically, the bank is being assisted to promote financial innovation for green financing, to mobilize private capital, to support green investments, and develop risk management frameworks that incorporate climate risk for both the ECCB and its licensees. So I'll end it there. And just to note that the NDC partnership, our aim here is really to empower countries with dedicated technical and financial support for them to be able to implement their ambitious climate actions, which involves accessing the climate finance that's needed. So thank you, Raphael.
Thank you very much, Amanda, for this overview and for sticking to the time. With that in mind, if you allow me, I would just have a quick. I mean, we'll have a discussion afterwards, but just one thought that sparked in my mind as you were giving your examples, and perhaps building on the initial point that I was raising around the differentiation of typology of countries within the region. If we think, between a middle or upper middle income country that typically has a relatively established project pipeline, including a renewable energy projects and some capacity, as we see even in our data, to let's say a benefit from public finance loan, as well as mobilize private finance in that context. And the difference between that and some of the Caribbean countries where relatively smaller size, a completely different, let's say, climate mitigation / resilience exposure profile. And when you were mentioning the banking sort of like initiative within the Caribbean region from a risk perspective, perhaps rather than it just sparked in my mind whether you had a broader, in a way, sort of like message for us in terms of the differentiation, again, in the NDC partnership support and so on, between these quite different, in a way, starting points from a developing country perspective. So a few words on that would be helpful, I think.
Yeah, definitely. So I'll keep it brief because it's a really challenging question to unpack. But our approach is really twofold. So we're working to support all countries that are coming to the NDC partnership for support, and we have a number of global strategies. But in order to implement those, in almost every case, it requires a really tailored country-specific approach. And I think the LAC example is the key example to that. This is such a heterogeneous region, and the needs in South American countries versus the needs in Caribbean countries are very different, and even the needs within the Caribbean are very different. So one of the things that we've been trying to do is to create opportunities for countries to learn from each other. And so drawing together countries in the region who have similar challenges and can learn from that. So that's one opportunity. The other one is exactly what I mentioned in my intervention in terms of trying to look at where support can actually be deployed at a regional level. And we have a few other examples in the Caribbean region, for instance, where there's been discussion about regional energy targets, for instance, and how the region can be working together to implement that. And from the perspective of finance, this can be extremely helpful to scale up some of the needs and to create a more robust project pipeline that's cutting across countries, which is something, at least from our discussions with the private sector, that we've heard is a key need. So I'll leave it there, but thanks, Rafael.
Thanks, Amanda. And hopefully in the discussion with our audience, there might be some of the countries sort of further illustrating some of the points that you've made here. Great, thanks. Let us turn then to our second panelist for today, which is Sandra Guzman. I've introduced Sandra earlier on. Just to flag that, again, I think, Sandra, you bring a wealth of experience of also capacity building and assistance to countries in the climate finance space, but also very much also at a technical level, and I'm sure you've got some very sort of like interesting insights for us on that basis. So Sandra, the floor is yours, and I understand you may address us in Spanish, so I invite our English speakers to switch on the interpretation at the bottom of the screen as needed. Sandra, over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Rafael. Yes, I will intervene in Spanish. Muchísimas gracias por
Thank you very much for your invitation to participate in this session, mainly in a critical time where we are not speaking about the $100 billion as an important element and how all the countries have transferred these 100 billion to the developing countries. But now we are defining a financing goal that has to be defined in a collective manner, and mainly that it has to be quantifiable. And a fundamental or a key element of the financing goal has to take into consideration the funding or the financing needs of the developing countries. So this conversation is quite important. And I would like to emphasize some items that are quite important and key for Latin America. This is that in Latin America, we don't just have to talk about how to increase climate financing or how to accelerate or streamline this climate finance, but how are we going to do to decelerate the financing that is increasing emissions in countries? Let me tell you why are we speaking about financing, and we need to have the positive version, to know what is helping us to tackle the issue, as well as how are we going to understand that financing or that funding that is going to activities that continue to produce highly pollutant emissions. So that what we have created in the GF-LAC, what we are trying to understand is which are all those income and outcome that are related to the sustainable sources. And we are also analyzing which are the incomes and outcomes that are going to intensive activities that are intensive in carbon. So I would like to offer you a context. In the case of sustainable income, for example, which are the financing sources that at the beginning we were listening about, we clearly identify that since Latin America is not the only receiver or recipient of financing, we have a non-equitative situation here. I mean, we still have only 5 countries, Mexico, Brazil, Colombia, recently Costa Rica. But when we speak of the whole diversity of countries in the region, we know that not all of the countries are receiving in the same way. And this is a key aspect when we speak about financing. But then we have another issue that has to do with that the intensive carbon incomes, those that are coming through concessions and exports that have to do with oil, gas, and other exports, are overcoming on 20 times the investments that we receive in the region. So our countries are depending a lot in activities that are carbon intensive to create incomes in order to pay the bills, to pay it in some way for education, health, and others. So this is a latent issue, even in countries like Costa Rica, that has a decarbonization important plant, but we still are depending on a carbon intensive income. But on the other hand, we are also identifying the complexity that all the Latin American countries are facing to transform their public finance systems to invest more and more financing to address the issue. So very few countries are spending. For example, if we see the main countries, which are the 20 countries that are the high emitters, only a couple of them are spending more than 1% of the public budget in actions like, for example, energy transition. It doesn't mean that energy transition is not happening, but not necessarily with public resources. There is an important participation of the private sector. But how are we going to achieve that the climate change item is going to be integrated in a cross-sectional manner for the energy, transportation, agricultural sector, and others? And what we continue observing in the region is that we still have a very important expenditure because of what we were saying. We still are depending on other things. And with this, I must say that the budget, if we see it as a whole picture, the countries are spending 39 times more in these activities that are non-zero carbon. So on the one hand, we have an issue of access. And Amanda was mentioning, because not all the countries are accepting or are abiding by all the mechanisms that we have available for the climate change. But the rules to access are quite limited regarding the fact that we have, for example, a language barrier. In Latin America, we always have to have or to abide by information in English. So we have also an issue to follow up or to monitor, specifically when we change administrations. For example, to access a green fund of the climate takes us up to 2 years. And some countries have already implemented or we are just starting to implementing, and we change administration. So we need to have a flexible and faster, quicker change in order to abide or to address all these issues. Another topic is how to set the needs of climate. If you check the NDCs, only 5 countries of the region has set the cost of a climate action. Others have done it in independent studies, but only 5 have reflected the NDC. So it is important to set out the needs, which is not easy. And let me tell you, because I have tried it and as a decision maker part, but how can we do it? Like, for example, through mechanisms like the readiness of the Green Fund to set out their needs, to help them identify which are the gaps. How much do I have? How much do I need? How am I going to close the gaps according to my needs? Which also means that the donors need to respond also to those needs. So it's not only that the developing countries are going to set out their needs, but how is that the developed countries are addressing those needs? And finally, I would like to tell you that it is quite important to create, to develop sustainable capacities in the countries. And here is where the huge opportunity lies. We are not just to say how are we going to implement a mitigation project or an adaptation project, but how are we going to transform economies of our countries to achieve this fair transition, really understanding that our countries have to decouple them or detach their economy from all these things in order to create new jobs, new income sources, so that they are allowed to detach really and to stop thinking on the indebtedness levels that they have in the regions. How are we going to have some schemes and projects to reduce this financial load in order to achieve the transformation? Because if they do not achieve it, it's going to be very difficult for the region to face the issues that obviously are not going to be solved only by international financing. International financing or funding is crucial and paramount, but it's going to be very important to have a good leverage with public resources. So these are my comments. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Similarly to Amanda, a very quick follow-up of the same nature, and feel free to sort of like in a way ditch the question if GFLAC has not necessarily addressed this in its work. I was just wondering if in a few sentences you could also reflect a bit similarly on this differentiation between, let's say, relatively large Latin American countries and SIDS and LDCs in the context of everything that you said. You know, you've talked about the need for alignment beyond sort of pure climate finance, public budgets, the issue of access and so on, and whether in your work there's been some findings and sort of on this clearly different profile within the region. So a few words about that would be welcome if relevant.
Sí, totalmente. Muchas gracias. Definitivamente creo que este es uno de los
Yes, of course, I agree. Surely this is one of the most important topics when we speak about the developing countries. We cannot place them in the same basket. There is a huge diversity of stakeholders in Latin America. We have more developed economies. We are speaking about Brazil and Mexico that are higher. And we also have starting economies like, for example, Colombia, which are in a scale that they have to develop lots of things in Central America and the Caribbean. So this has to do with the type of financing that we need. Of course, capabilities and capacities are needed at all the levels in all the countries, but we can here see also a differentiated need. For example, we have countries in Latin America that are not managing or handling well their indebtedness. And now, for example, if they increase their financing or their funding, and this is important, you know that at global level, less than the 10% of international financing goes to adaptation and the rest to mitigation. And in Latin America, there is a very similar behavior, even though we are a quite vulnerable region. So I think that this is something to address. The Caribbean, the Central American countries need more donations in order to be or to intervene in adaptation. And the issue that adaptation is that it's not profitable, quote unquote, as called in some banks and companies. So this has to do a lot with how countries are going to develop their financing strategies. And this is something that we drive a lot from the LAC. How are we going to have strategies so that they can set out this project portfolio that are associated to the NDCs or the NAPs, and to identify how much I'm able to mobilize, how much do I need in private or international financing to close this gap. So yes, there is a huge and important difference because these are quite diverse economies, and this plays an important role, and unfortunately it plays a role to access. Mexico, for example, has more access to financing, and Brazil also, and Nicaragua not so much. So this is an issue that we are facing, and this has to change if we would like to talk about financing as in a fair context. Thank you very much, Rafael.
We'll take the floor later on to perhaps further illustrate the points that we're discussing here right now. Before we do that, let me turn to our third panelist, Sebastian from the OECD Development Center. Sebastian, I understand that you may be able to share with us, in addition to reflecting on the discussion questions, some of the preliminary findings that are coming out of the forthcoming Latin America economic outlook, and within that, some focus on climate, I think. So, Sebastian, the floor is yours, and looking forward to hear your thoughts on these issues.
Thanks a lot, Rafael, and it's a pleasure to be with you and to discuss our thoughts that we have in climate finance and that we're going to present in the forthcoming Latin American Economic Outlook. Let me switch to Spanish to take advantage of the translators, and I will do the same as Sandra. Entonces, quisiera
So, I would like to share a presentation with you, a very brief presentation on how we have addressed anything that has to do with green finance, specifically for the transition in Latin America. A starting point is that we need to focus on the investment needs for Latin America to achieve precisely the goals that this green transition must have in order to have a better transition in the region. In a general way, we can say that in Latin America, the infrastructure investment has to grow around 5% of the regional GDP. And specifically to achieve that a matrix for renewable electricity for 2030, we will require to invest around 1.3% of the regional GDP in the next 10 years. Another item which is quite linked that of what we are working in the 2022 Latin American report in the COP27 is that to create these formal jobs, we require with the green transition to increase the added value of the green sectors by 3 percentage points regarding with what we have right now. So undoubtedly, there are quite important financing needs, and if we don't achieve them, we are not going to attain the green transition that we need in Latin America, and we will have low jobs that will add up to this informality rate that we have in the region. So I would like to insist in two main items. First of all, how do we need to improve or enhance our fiscal framework, taking into consideration the green agenda? And secondly, how to improve the financing strategies in the region. On the fiscal side, undoubtedly, we have everything that has to do with taxes, that have to do with the environment. We also have all the instruments and the regulations that we need to use or to take advantage of bond emissions and green assets. And on the strategy side, it's very important to support the development banks at a subnational and national level. And finally, we also need to see how to expand all the development finance strategies on the private sector. So, before these conditions, we would like to see how is that we can better the fiscal frameworks. This is what we have seen in Latin America. We still have a very high percentage of financial resources that are coming from the taxes that is imposed to companies. So if we would like to have a better entrepreneurship and more investments, we have to increase this structure. Nevertheless, in Latin America, we collect very few. It's around 22% of the GDP regarding or with respect or compared with the OECD countries, but we have to see how this tax structure is focused on indirect taxes and also income taxes in companies. More than 15% of taxes in the companies are coming from companies, and in the countries of the OECD, it's less than 10%. So we need to enhance, to improve this in progressive manner. I mean, the fiscal taxes in Latin America. And everything that has to do with the green entrepreneurship. We also see that a very important resources fund in Latin America represent only the 1% of the GDP, and in the OECD countries, we are speaking about double, 2% of the GDP, what they collect from the taxes that have to do with environment. So once again, we have to enhance this structure. Nevertheless, we have to take into consideration what kind of supporting mechanisms to the vulnerable countries we have in order to have more focalized policies in vulnerable populations that may be impacted by this kind of taxes. Now, going beyond this, we are also going to see how many sources of resources we have. An important point, and this it was compared with the African economies. In Latin America, the collection that we have, or the incomes that we have in the ODA, are quite reduced. We are speaking of less than 1% of the GDP. So if we compare it with the previous numbers that we were giving you, 22%, this is quite reduced. And we have to see how financially we can help the development and what are the sources that we have to take into consideration, specifically mechanisms that have to do with direct investment, portfolio investment, but also the other activities that the multilateral banks may have. And precisely what we have seen in Latin America is that there is a very important growth of all the assets that have to do with social bonds, green bonds, sustainable bonds, as well as those that are sustainable linked bonds. That is why what we have observed is a very important growth since 2019. For example, in the case of Chile, this is the first country in the world that has issued a global bond regarding the sustainability linked bonds. And it was the first country in the region to issue a local and sovereign bond where they have a green component. In the case of Chile, we are also speaking about the sovereign bond, but it is very important and paramount what we see right now, that the private emissions have been growing, and currently the high emitter of bonds are the companies. So undoubtedly here we have a very important role on how companies can issue more bonds. And lastly, how can we decarbonize the society by regulations or through regulations to have more green funding, to have a green taxonomy, which is fundamental for the region? How are we going to strengthen the statistics that have to do with the green projects and to help the financing of these projects with the bonds that I have mentioned before? How to advance to development of their pipelines, of different agents that we have precisely to do the matching with this green financing agenda. Many times this green financing is available, but they do not have a good tracking of the different projects. And finally, to support further expansion mechanisms of the DAC members to the sustainable financing projects. So these are some of the reflections that I wanted to share with you, and that we will be addressing also in our next forum. Thank you very much for the invitation, and it was a pleasure to share with you this presentation. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Sebastian, for sharing these thoughts. And with having a bit of time before turning to the audience, if you don't mind, I would ask you a similar questions to our first two speakers, which is within what you've discussed on, and I think some of it spoke to what Sandra was discussing on, public budgets and also fiscal alignment in terms of in relation to sort of environmental and climate objectives, but also the issue of bond issuance and the capacity to do so, for instance, whether in your work, from all these different perspectives in terms of capacities, in terms of needs, what kind of differentiated sort of perspective do you see within the region, in particular between, relatively, middle-income countries and SIDS, again, going back to that sort of not divide, but that clear difference within the region, whether you would have a few reflections for us on that before we go to the questions from the audience.
Thanks, Rafael. Primero, digamos, muy en
Well,
línea con-
first of all, and aligned with what Sandra was mentioning, is heterogeneity. That's a very clear issue in the region, like, for example, Brazil and Mexico, and Colombia that has been a little bit more active in the region, and Chile as the first country that has issued these bonds. And something very important is green taxonomy. We need to have very clear rules and regulations where we have principles on what to define in the region. And what we have seen is that there are several Latin American countries that have progressed along these lines with the aim of having a comparative framework, for example, to what is happening in Europe. And this is precisely something that we insist a lot in our report. What kind of cooperation and international partnerships we need? It goes beyond the help. Undoubtedly, we have to take into consideration these different criteria that we have, for example, in the green personality by the European Commission. How can we adapt it or translate it to the Latin American context to allow precisely to have bonds that have this appetite at the international level for all the investors that might be interested in this type of assets. So this is something that is paramount, and in Latin America, we are advancing, but not in all the countries. So we are speaking, or we have to start thinking on the second stage of the more active countries in this market.
Thanks for bringing in the topic of taxonomies. I think this is something that we're seeing emerging in many different jurisdictions around the world, including emerging and developing economies, and that's really interesting. I think as a tool, both domestically, but also to bring clarity to international finance providers, both public and private, in terms of what the countries need, if the taxonomies indeed do match sort of the content of the NDCs and so on and so on. So thanks for bringing that topic, and I'm sure it will be discussed further in the next session as well on mobilizing private sector investment. With that in mind, we've done our round with our first round, let's say, with our three panelists. As mentioned originally, we would like to turn to the audience, and we have a range of countries I see within the list of participants across the region, representing different national circumstances and characteristics. And I think it'd be very interesting to hear from the countries, either as questions back to our three panelists on the points that they've raised, or perhaps also for the countries to illustrate some of the points with their own national sort of like experiences of accessing international climate finance, or developing strategies, to better sort of like, access or implement as well climate activities. So that would be very interesting to hear. Yes, so again, I see a range of countries and invite them to raise their hands so that we can benefit from that sort of collective sort of experiences within the virtual room here today. Okay, while we wait for countries to raise their hand, I will turn to Rodolfo. I see that you've highlighted your hand, so over to you, Rodolfo, first.
Gracias, Rafael.
Thank you very much, Rafael. I would just like to motivate a little bit more the participation in Latin American countries. We have several representatives here in this meeting, and I would like to emphasize two specific items. As Dr. Sandra Guzman was mentioning, access is an issue in the region. It is a serious issue in the region because financial institutions are looking to decrease the risk by distributing the risk with other financial institutions. And each one of these institutions that are participating, for example, the Green Planning Fund with multilateral banks, and then with local banks, and then the first level bank, each one of these institutions is adding conditions and steps that they have to do, which limits the time and the resources, because they literally remain or do not allocate part of the resources that they have. So this is limiting the Paris Agreement. So this is an issue. So the countries that are present that have had experiences in this regard, we would like to know about your opinions. How do you think that we can solve this issue? And the other thing has to do with the participation of the private sector. Fortunately, this is a time of booming in the private sector. What we are having with these EH systems, the private sector is looking where to invest in environmental and climate topics, and they want to make good investments. So there is a huge opportunity for the financial sector to support projects that are profitable. And of course, it is difficult to support projects which are not profitable, like the adaptation ones, but they are quite necessary. So as we say in Latin America, the bill and the number of the lotto is not matching, so we don't have the two winners aligned. But it's important to say that it is necessary to visualize the adaptation mechanisms as well as business, because they may be a business, like, for example, environmental services and many other productive activities. That's the case of agriculture. If we have good adaptation information to select the crop and to know where to plant, when to grow, this is a very important information for the agricultural sector and for the forestry sector and the livestock sector. So that was my comment. And if you have any other comments, go ahead.
And the question of further clarity on needs. I think that speaks very well as well to what our three panelists have addressed so far. The other thing I have in mind is that actually we have quite a few countries on the line that benefit or are involved in the NDC partnership, which Amanda has introduced us to. Some countries as well have been collaborating with GFLAC, and Sandra is here, our sort of representative. So I think there's a wealth of potential experiences to be shared and reflection. So I would again invite colleagues to sort of raise their hand, either to ask questions or reflect on some of the topics that our panelists or Rodolfo just highlighted. So we'll wait a few minutes perhaps with that in mind to see who might be interested to take the floor. In the meantime, Sandra, por favor.
Muchas gracias. Solo, bueno, en lo que
Thank you very much. While we wait for the rest of the colleagues to participate, I would like to add something. And this is also a kind of a question for our audience. There's one topic that we have identified when estimating needs, and it's there's very little information regarding the needs for adaptation. And there are many reasons. Adaptation sometimes it's not just a technological change. It's not like mitigation. Then you say, well, you make a change or going to electrical, and that is mitigation. But we're talking about processes that may take longer and that need more regionally focused intervention, like territorial intervention and other difficulties that complicate detecting or determining the needs, and that's why adaptation needs are subestimated, such as in Latin America. So we must really begin to think on how to improve understanding of adaptation, and not just in the framework of adaptation being just an expense, but consider it as an investment to give adaptation its due role so that we can accelerate investments. We've reached a point where many countries are constantly living with the impact, so we have to increase financing for adaptation, and that is essential, not just duplicating its financing as in COP26 commitments, because we are still very much in debt with adaptation, but how not just reach our goals, but increase it, how to improve our understanding, and how can we involve all the different stakeholders. Thank you.
Gracias, Sandra. And indeed, that's something that is often overlooked in discussions. So that's great. In the meantime, we do have a hand. So Adriana, CCAP, I think probably able to share some further thoughts with us on capacity building and needs. So over to you, Adriana, please. Please introduce yourself as well to the crowd. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Rafael. Buenos días a todos y a todas, o buenas tardes.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. I'm Adriana Bazar, specialist in climate financing for CCAP in Barbados. Following the narrative and what Mr. Lass and Dr. Sandra were talking about regarding climate financing for adaptation, I would like to talk about adaptation in vulnerable countries in the Caribbean and Central America. The fiscal caps of these countries are low, and current financial instruments we know are not working in accelerating financing. So we must rethink financing instruments and financing mechanism of different climate funds that make a contribution can really help to decrease the risk. So new stakeholders from the financial sector come into play, including central banks, development banks, commercial banks, insurance carriers. How can we rethink financial instruments such as insurance so that we can shield investments? We see natural disasters around every year, a hurricane, and we cannot plan in the long term when we are basically just patching things up a little bit here and then. So how can we ensure secure financing, climate financing sources to support after natural disasters that are happening every year, and how to plan for the future years? It's not just mitigation, because in mitigation we can have the private sector, but we need to be thinking about adaptation. And this is a question to our panelists. How can we rethink these financial instruments? And are financial instruments really working?
And perhaps on that basis, also with what Sandra was saying before, I mean, the last two interventions by Sandra and yourself, Adriana, are getting us more on the adaptation and resilience side. And perhaps turning back to our first panelist, Amanda, we haven't heard from you since the beginning. I would perhaps, if you're okay with that, ask you to come in and perhaps share a few more insights from your work with a zoom on the resilience and adaptation side of the NDC partnership work, and how that may address some of the issues that Sandra and Adriana just raised, if that's okay with you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to come in on this question. And certainly adaptation is one of the more challenging areas that we're dealing with. And I wanted to share a few of the insights that we've had over the past few months. We've been working with the UN Secretary General's Office, UNDP, and GCF to actually see how we can better highlight some of the adaptation investment needs that countries have, and how we can bring additional funding to them. And there's a common set of challenges that we faced, which I believe are key to really helping to increase investment in this field. And the first thing I want to note is, Adriana, you're absolutely right in terms of the lack of economic opportunity sometimes, or viability of adaptation projects. One thing that we're hearing though from the private sector in our discussions with them is that they understand that, but they see the benefits that will have in terms of building resilience in the economy as having knock-on effects for further investments. And so even though there might not be the traditional value that we're seeing, I think that the private sector understands the importance and the long-term value that these adaptation projects can have. But some of the challenges that we're seeing across countries that I want to highlight here, first is really building the internal capacity within governments. So supporting ministries of finance to translate some of the plans that they have into actionable adaptation targets. So that's the first challenge, and embedded capacity can really support with that. The second one is actually integrating these climate priorities into government processes, policies, and budgets. And so this is key to building out the enabling environment in the country, which for adaptation projects, I think is even more critical. The third one is actually on project development. And what we're seeing and what we're really encouraging countries to do is to double down on project development. So really working across sectoral ministries, with finance ministry, development ministry, to pull together the projects and ideally to be putting them in a consolidated pipeline that's up to date. Because one of the challenges that we're hearing as well is that there's a scarcity of projects, and private sector comes in and they actually aren't able to identify projects that are viable and that they can invest in. And so governments working across ministries to pull these together can actually be quite impactful. So I'll leave it there just in terms of insights, but just to say that this is definitely a critical area. But from our perspective, there's been some positive movements from the private sector. And so I think things that are moving in the right direction.
Many thanks, Amanda, for these reflections. As we don't have a lot of time left, and I see a hand raised by Mexico, I will straight turn to our colleague Gerardo. Please, over to you to take the floor and share your question or reflection.
Sí, ¿me escuchan?
Can you hear me all right? I'm sorry, I cannot turn my camera on, but I just have one question. This is a very interesting conversation. We have learned a lot. And I have a question regarding this commitment of $100 billion a year from 2009. Originally, when this commitment was made, there was a question of whether this was additional to official aid for development, or if it was part of official aid for development. That is, where did this $100 billion a year fall regarding that commitment of 0.7% of GDP to be given by developed countries, and developed countries said that developing countries said that it had to be additional, that it cannot come from the AOD financing, but other things were said in other places that happened obviously over 10 years ago. So my question is, what was the end of that discussion and where are we today? Those $100 billion are above or additional to the AOD, or are they part of AOD and that 0.7% commitment? So if you could give us a summary or a broad view of the situation.
Definitely an important but very sensitive and I have to say technically complicated question as well, because additionality can be defined in many different ways. You've highlighted one potential definition. There's others that have been discussed over the years. I'm not sure we would have time to address this question and treat it properly within the 5 minutes that we have remaining. With that in mind, what I would quickly say is that bear in mind that the UNFCCC Standing Committee on Finance itself is producing a report to take stock at the meta level of all the information, data, and issues relating to the 100 billion goal, and that will be released during the COP on the 9th of November. I'm not quite sure whether they will address the issue of additionality, and if they do, how they do with that. But I think that might be a good opportunity to pursue that discussion. If you don't mind me, in a way, leaving that question aside for the 5 minutes that we have left, because I don't think we could treat that topic with the level of detail and that it deserves. But thank you for raising this point. Definitely important, and I'm sure it'll be part of other conversations. Now, Sebastian, I think you've got your hands up. I was going to turn to you anyway on the issue of resilience and adaptation that our previous interventions have highlighted, in the sense that your work deals a lot with economic analysis more broadly, and we know that resilience and climate resilience within that context are taking an increasingly important share of attention of broad analysis of economic resilience. So perhaps a few thoughts from your side would be helpful in that context, reflecting on what Amanda and our other sort of like speakers have raised in relation to adaptation and resilience needs.
Thanks, Rafael. Yeah, I would like to insist on this, and in particular what Adriana Bazan just raised about the different, capacities and levels of access to finance to make it happen, across Latin America and the Caribbean countries. So let me continue in Spanish. Primero, como mencionaba también Rodolfo, digamos
First,
que
as Rodolfo was saying, there is an important differentiation between or among Latin American countries, and there is something that is related to this project financed by the European Commission, which is a possibility of transition, or what type of cooperation can be attained with countries such as Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, or Chile, and what can these countries can help other countries, but involving other countries that are very much interested in developing assets like European countries. So all this transition lies perfectly well and highlights the importance of dialogue among countries. But we've seen that beyond all the mechanisms that we've mentioned, there are others important for the Caribbean economies. For example, the city bonds or catastrophe bonds. These are bonds for catastrophes, and World Bank has already issued one of about 200 million euros issued to Jamaica as aid to respond to these risks of catastrophe. Another important point is all that is related to natural disasters and how payments are tied to risk exposure. And for example, Grenada was able to decrease public debt importantly, about 95% of GDP to 56% of GDP by including this type of provisions. Of course, there is a risk regarding capacity to comply with these provisions and mechanisms and continue with the issuance. But we've already seen experiences, but following what Adriana said, there's a lot more to be done in the Caribbean. Their figures are much lower than what I presented for Mexico and South American economies.
Those considerations are very helpful in that context. We're 2 minutes short of the end of the session. Rodolfo, I was wondering if you wanted to make a few closing remarks, and then perhaps also bridge the topic to the next session, so that our audience knows what to expect in 15 or 30 minutes. So over to you.
Gracias, Rafael. Sí, efectivamente, yo creo que tenemos muchos elementos que pueden ayudar a destrabar el financiamiento que es necesario en la región. Estos mecanismos que menciona Sebastián Nieto son muy importantes. Evidentemente, nos gustaría, como lo dijo Amanda, ver en los NDCs todos los elementos prospectivos de las necesidades económicas que los países tienen, también para poder empatar la necesidad con la oferta, si es que podríamos decir de financiamiento, aunque es en realidad un conjunto de instrumentos de implementación del Acuerdo de París que nosotros debemos agilizar ahora que estamos en el periodo de implementación del mismo. Entonces, tenemos un panorama muy claro ahorita, gracias a ustedes, a sus intervenciones, sus presentaciones, y el siguiente tema, después del coffee break, será el del financiamiento privado, porque hemos hablado de los millones y de los billones, pero es en el sector privado donde vamos a encontrar los trillones. Entonces, aquí la dejo y creo que ella nos va a decir qué es lo que sigue. Gracias, Rafael. Gracias a todos por participar.
Rodolfo, I think we have a short hand raised from Brazil. Do we want to take it? We have, yeah.
Oh, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Por favor.
It is important.
We don't have translation, I think. There was no translation.
And me gustaría
Guzman, she talked about the difficulties of countries to access external financing system, and I would like to know if they evaluate the difficulties that the productive sectors, for example, the small land owners, for instance, in the difficulty they have to access the existing finance system in their country in Latin America. In the case of Brazil, for instance, in regions when we have the most vulnerable people, as the Northeast region, these family landowners are not capable of taking credits from the public financing systems. And so it's not a mean of having credit available, but the condition these people, the most vulnerable, have to access this credit.
Any of our panelists want to
Rafael.
quickly take that one? Sandra, I see you smiling. Por favor, Sandra.
No, thank you so much. And I think this is precisely one of the critical problems. So the actual assessment of needs is very difficult. Most of the assessments that have been conducted are at the central government level, not necessarily at the local level. For instance, the colleague is talking about what is happening in the farmers, no, at the small level. And this is the level where we need the information, no? What they need to actually understand not only how much, but like the size of the intervention. And this is what I'm saying, the lack of information comes precisely at that level. And then, as you really correctly pointed out, the critical problem of access is precisely related to the local communities, to the local farmers, that they do not necessarily have the legal entities to access directly to these mechanisms, so, which is really increasing the problem. And these are two elements that if we really want to make, if we really want to transform the climate finance flows in the coming years, we have to change these two things, like assessing better the needs at the local level, including local communities, indigenous communities, and all cities even, and change the way that the mechanisms work, like creating potentially different type of accessing windows, really adequating these windows to the different entities, including local entities that are not necessarily, like institutionalized or something. But if we don't tackle these, it's going to be extremely difficult to really be successful and effective when we talk about climate finance. So yeah, these are two very critical and important points. Thank you.
Thank you.
Gracias, Sandra. And with that, I think it is time to close this session, allow for a short break. And Aya, can you remind us when people should be back in front of their screen and with their headphones on?
Yes.
And sorry, I just want to thank our three panelists for being here with us and sharing insightful. Muchas gracias. Thanks a lot.
I join your thanks to the panelists, but also to you, Rafael, for very, very, very good moderation, and we were almost in time. So in fact, what we wanted to suggest now to take a group photo for today. So if you could put on your camera, so we will have pictures of everybody who have been joining and who will be joining here. Hopefully you all are there and hear me. Please put on your camera, the camera on. Okay, I think the colleague is saying that the photo is taken. So thank you very much. No, not yet. Sorry. Okay, It seems that it's fine now. So we will come back in 15 minutes. So it will be on 15 minutes. Yeah. Yeah. I'm just looking what's the time now. Yeah. 4:35. 15 minutes break for coffee, tea, water, whatever, and see you soon. We will talk about the private finance. Very interesting topic. Geraldine is there already, but we will make a small break.
Muchas gracias.
Hi, Geraldine. This is Paul Martin from the World Bank. I just want to check everything's working okay. I can't hear you.
Yes, we hear you.
Oh, there we
Thank
go.
you.
Okay.
Welcome, Paul.
Hi, Paul. I'm great to hear you're here. We didn't know if you were going to join on it.
Oh, no, I'm here.
Great. Perfect.
Good. Okay, so we're on coffee break at the moment, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, we are resuming in 1 minute.
Okay, very good. And I'm just going to turn off my camera for a moment then.
Paul, can I just confirm, are you using slides?
Okay. I think we are ready to start this third session. And thank you all for joining us back to the third session, and also welcome to those who are just now joining us, new participants. So the session 3 is focused on climate finance in Latin America and Caribbean, setting the right incentives to mobilize private climate finance. So let me introduce you to Geraldine Ang. She is policy analyst, green finance and investment from the Environment Directorate at the OECD, and she will moderate the next session, and she will also give us some key takeaways from the 9th OECD Forum on Green Finance and Investment, which was just recently held at the online, in fact, and also some points which could be interesting from the LAC country perspective. So Geraldine, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Heya, for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be virtually with you. What I would suggest is, since it's the last session of the day, I would encourage everyone who's listening to us to turn your video on if you have the bandwidth, so we can try to have a more interactive conversation in advance. Thanks so much. I know sometimes the virtual format is not easy, but hopefully we'll make it worth your while. We'll keep space for panel discussion at the end, and thank you all for listening. So like Aya mentioned, I work as a senior policy analyst and project manager in the Green Finance and Environment team. Just in a nutshell, we've been working for over a decade on how to mobilize finance and investment in support of climate and biodiversity goals. And like Aya mentioned, we held the annual flagship event, which is the OECD Forum on Green Finance and Investment, for its 9th edition virtually just a couple of days ago on 5th to 7th of October. We had around 1,800 attendees virtually from 130 countries, and almost all Latin American countries were represented. So there were lots of relevant discussions on Latin America. Just as a central discussion, the forum centered around how to move from commitment to action in the decade for delivery towards impactful green and sustainable finance. And I think this will resonate with many of you attending, that there's a need for move away from the target setting, the goal, the commitment, into the concrete mobilization of private finance. And indeed, as many of you know, achieving climate objectives requires an unprecedented acceleration of financial flows into climate-aligned investment, a shift away from investment in harmful emission-intensive activities. And this is whether through public, private, or blended finance. And we all know that public finance alone cannot fill the climate investment gap. And the good news in a way is that there is no shortage of globally available capital. And I know you've just been talking about the 100 billion goal with my colleague Raphael Zhashnik. And of course, when we compare the trillions and the billions, it's a little daunting. But, you know, OECD and G20 institutional investors alone have around 64 trillions of assets under management. So beyond the 100 billion goal, I think here the question is the $1 trillion question in a way is how can we unlock private finance for the climate transition, but also for the broader environmental transition, and channel it towards net zero resilient projects, especially in emerging and developing countries. And I think we all agree that governments and development financial institutions can play a critical role in leveraging scarce public finance from NDBs and public finance to scale up and leverage private sector investment. And we need to mobilize that scarce funding. And here, development banks have a critical role to play in leveraging their blended finance and other sources of funding, in helping governments to strengthen domestic enabling conditions, in whether they use blended finance and other de-risking financial instruments, transaction enablers, etc., whether they address market rigidities, for example, in the electricity sectors, whether they work on public governance, improving corporate governance, encouraging due diligence of responsible business conduct across supply chains, etc., etc. And there's also a lot that needs to happen beyond the enabling conditions on the investment side, on the financial side, and the supply side of finance, whether to improve the financial regulatory framework for assessing and managing financial related climate and other environmental risks. And we can think here about the role of taxonomies, the role of portfolio allocation, the role of disclosure, etc., etc. So I have a fantastic panel with me today to discuss the role of incentives to mobilize private finance in Latin American countries in particular, and including the role of development banks, which are so critical. So we have with us today Mr. Kirk Douglas, who is Director for the Center on Biosecurity Studies at the Universities of the West Indies. Thank you for joining with us today. Mr. Ruben Avila Garcia, Climate Finance Specialist at the Central American Bank for Economic Integration, BCIE. Thank you so much. Ms. Alicia Montalvo Santamaria, Climate Action and Positive Biodiversity Manager and Corporate Vice President of Strategic Programming at the CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America, and Paul Jonathan Martin, who is a lead specialist and acting practice manager for environment, natural resources, and blue economy at the World Bank. Thank you all so much. And let me just start and turn to Mr. Kirk Douglas to provide a brief 5-minute opening remarks as a Kickstarter.
Hello, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much for having me. My apologies for not turning on my camera at present. I just wanted to say that in terms of the OECD, in terms of the climate change conversation that we've been having, there are some interesting things that we have to be cognizant of, particularly in terms of the vulnerabilities that Latin American countries and Caribbean countries that we inherently have. One is the strong dependency on imports as it relates to trade. Also tourism, especially for the Caribbean, that's our major revenue generator. For most Caribbean countries, we are heavily reliant on tourism. That is also another vulnerability. Also transport and also travel. So these 4 T's, as we say in biosecurity, are vulnerabilities that every country has, but some countries have a greater dependency on some of these activities, and that actually exposes them to more risk. So for the Caribbean, tourism, we have lots of persons coming in. That also leaves us with a waste problem in terms of the environmental impact. So it's not only the waste generated by persons who live within each Caribbean country, but you're also dealing with the waste of the millions of tourists that come into the region every single year. So that is a problem because we are developing the tourism industry, but concomitantly or simultaneously, we are not developing the waste management systems in tandem with the speed at which we're developing our tourism industry. And that is creating a problem from an environmental standpoint, from a sustainability standpoint, and also with trade. All of the heavy reliance on imports, all of the plastic, all of these other waste products that come into the islands, we don't necessarily have the requisite waste management systems to adequately deal with them. So we need a partnership not only with government, not only with the community, but also with the private sector to be able to understand the impact that business is also having in terms of sustainability for Caribbean countries. So this is very important because as we speak of sustainable development within Latin America and within the Caribbean, we have to be cognizant of these vulnerabilities. These are things that we can't get away from, because if we were to do away with tourism, if we were to do away with trade, we would all starve. We wouldn't exist. So we know that these things have to occur. But in terms of managing how well we manage the flow of trade, the flow of tourists coming in, and then also the management of waste within our countries, this is where we have to get innovative. This is where we can't take a cut and paste from, let's say, the bigger G8 countries and transpose it into our context. We have to look for innovative, homegrown solutions for our sustainability push and how we can mitigate and adapt to climate change within the Latin America and the Caribbean. So those will be my first opening remarks, and I will leave the floor open for the other panelists to give their inputs. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Kirk. And that's an interesting perspective from the Caribbean region on the need also for tailoring climate transition to the specific needs of the region. And of course, in your region, I'm assuming tourism is probably one of the key economic activities to watch here. Thanks a lot. So the next speaker is Mr. Ruben Avila Garcia, and I'm sorry for not pronouncing the name right, I'm sure. Climate finance specialist at BCIE CABE, who will present how CABE is mobilizing climate finance in the region. So Ruben, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining virtually.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. It's a pleasure to be here with you and to be here with these great panelists. Well, I would like to you know, in a brief presentation, I would like to show what CABE is doing with the support that we provide to our countries, and perhaps some specific focus on private sector initiatives, climate change private sector initiatives. We have been carrying out very important regional initiatives. So if I may present, should I share my screen now? If I may?
Please, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you see my screen now?
Very well, thanks.
Okay, I would like just to pass very fast on these slides, just to have a guidance or on when our institution became a very important player in the region when it comes to supporting climate change initiatives. This comes from our highest level authorities, which is the Governor's Assembly of CABE, of the Central American Bank of Economic Integration. Since 2016, our Governor's Assembly made a commitment, a statement to promote initiatives, projects, programs that contribute to adaptation and mitigation to climate change. Later on, in 2019, our Board of Governors made a statement to refrain from financing projects related to coal exploration and extraction and coal-based energy generation. So that's what's so-called the zero carbon statement. And more recently, in 2022, we have made two statements which are very important: the commitment to the Glasgow Climate Pact as a result of the COP26 and the climate pact that derived from that convention, and also in the Summit of the Americas, CABE and other important development banks in the region made a commitment to mobilize $50 billion for climate change operation in the next 5 years. So this is very important, considering what the other colleague was mentioning, that our country, the Central American countries, are highly vulnerable to climate change. In fact, a few weeks ago, we had a hurricane that came to Central America, which was the Julia hurricane that later come to a tropical storm, but made also important and significant impacts in our countries, mainly Nicaragua, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. So CABE has been supporting climate change operations in the last 7 years. And out of our total commitments, 40% of our total commitments are addressing either adaptation or mitigation projects and programs. This is also very important to tell you, and also basically our strategy to mobilize climate financing in the region is based on these 3 pillars that I'm showing you. Firstly, we have credit lines with institutional partners that work with us regarding climate change projects, and they support these projects. So we have these credit lines with them. This is a very important pillar of our strategy, and we have been mobilizing more than 1 billion with these partners. We are also accredited with global climate funds, mainly the Green Climate Fund, the Adaptation Fund, and the European Union. And we have been mobilizing more than 540 million for climate change initiatives and very strategic initiatives for us. It's mainly for adaptation and mitigation. And later I will tell you a little bit about a private sector initiative, which is very important for us, which is the Dry Corridor Initiative. And we have also been issuing ESG bonds. So these are basically our strategy to mobilize climate finance in the region. Then I would like to tell you a little bit about the mobilization that we have been having with perhaps our main partner in climate finance now, which is the Green Climate Fund. We have been mobilizing 4 major investment projects, and the climate impact overall is around 55 million greenhouse gases avoided, tons of greenhouse gases avoided, and more than 3 million people with increased or greater resilience to climate change. So it is important to note that regarding private sector initiatives, we have been working with intermediary financial institutions. We have a network in Central America of almost 100, we call it FIs or IFIs, with which we channel our resources. And this is one very important initiative. I wanted to show you like an example of this kind of initiatives. We want to de-risk the access to, we want to increase the access of vulnerable communities located in the Dry Corridor region of Central America to credit instruments and credit mechanisms in order for them to access to these resources, these highly concessional resources that are channeled through CABE and that come from the GCF in this case. And this is also complemented by technical assistance in order to reduce the risk of mainly the producers that are located in these regions, and that they need this technical assistance to implement ecosystem-based adaptation measures and restoration measures. So we are trying to de-risk this credit profile of these producers in order for them to access to credit with the best conditions in the market that are available. In this case, with the support from the GCF and from CABE as well. And this is like a very general picture of the financial structure of this program with in order for you to have like an idea of how is the flow coming from the GCF administered by CABE, and at the end goes to the program beneficiaries that are located in the watersheds, in the catchments in each of the countries. This is a program that is going to impact 7 countries in our region, so it's a very strategic and a very important program for us. And later on, I wanted to show you a little bit about our ESG bond issuances. We have a framework for the green bonds. We have a framework for social bonds as well. And we are currently working in a framework for blue bonds. And we are about to have this framework in order for us to start issuing blue bonds to finance projects related to blue economy and to protect the oceans, mainly in Central America, and to start supporting this project with proceeds from blue bonds. So we have already been issuing ESG bonds, mainly in Asia and in the European markets, basically the Swiss market and the Taiwan market, and also the Japanese market when it comes to social bonds, and also the North American market and the Mexican market. So this is what I wanted to tell you in a nutshell, basically, because we don't have too much time. So thank you very much again, and a pleasure to answer any question you may have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. This was extremely interesting. I feel I have a lot of questions I would like to ask you, but maybe I'll stop to move to the panel discussion and maybe ask you to think about that question for the panel discussion, which is, I see you have a range of products from green bonds on the more, like financial market driven, to grants on the least leveraging kind of private finance. And curious to know where you see the role of blended finance in that space and for what kind of projects. But either you want to answer now or we can discuss it later in the panel discussions. Maybe let's move to the next speaker, and I'll come back to you, I think, later, but thank you so much. Ms. Alicia Montalvo Santamaria, I want to invite you to intervene next. You're Climate Action and Positive Biodiversity Manager and Corporate Vice President of Strategic Programming at the CAF. So Alicia, it's a pleasure to have you joining virtually. Thank you so much. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. En primer lugar, muchas gracias.
Gracias. Well, thank you very much, first of all, for inviting me to participate in this dialogue. Once again, it's a pleasure to hear, and it is quite vital. I don't know if it's just because we are in the world of climate financing to make reflections and to feel quite linked to all that has, to everyone that has those problems. There are many topics that I would like to elaborate a little bit more from the CAF experience. As you know, we have made a commitment, which is quite ambitious, to mobilize 40% of our approvals are climate financing for 2026. We are right now at 39%. But going back to the question that you were posing, how to accelerate and profitability and transparency to this facilitation and financing, I think that maybe we are focusing a lot in numbers, and that's important. Yes, of course, I think that's important. But at the end of the day, we have mentioned this all along this session. The key is how to find good projects, how to find this scope where institutions like that have to be focused on. And I would like to make an auto-criticism a little bit, because I think there is lacking clarity from the institutions that are providing financing to the countries according to how to access to them, how to supplement them, how to work together. Specifically, we are quite active, as my colleague Avila has explained, with Climate Fund. And sometimes this is confusing. I mean, are we mobilizing our own financing or third parties financing, how to complement them or supplement them, how do we do the blending, etc. So I think that this tracking and transparency exercise is quite important. But mainly, I'm concerned, and it has been also mentioned in the previous session, that we are focusing excessively on mitigation and not so much in adaptation. In adaptation, it's quite difficult to measure, because sometimes what we consider an adaptation project could be also a development project, a work project, infrastructure project. So this is where we have to make a little bit of a twist. And with my experience now in Latin America, I see that we have to focus or these climate financing topics has left behind all the other topics. And regarding taxonomy, it is paramount to work together to work with a new view, a new vision. Precisely now, we in CAF are working to perfect our taxonomy. We are quite interested in the work that the OECD is doing, and it's very important for us to advance to comparable taxonomies. But the issue is that these topics are not fitting in taxonomy. Of course, in the mitigation and adaptation, we are working, but we are working a lot in what you have said and nature-based solutions and also the ecosystems. There is a series of sectors there that we would like to promote. Is of course the agricultural and livestock sector that has lots of mitigation and adaptation matters, but also it has to do with ecosystem or the tourism sector, which is a cross-sectional sector. We have action for multiple sectors, so we always find these kind of challenges. Projects, for example, that has basic infrastructures and this infrastructure to a tourism destination in order to have water, electricity, to have job options that are associated to the ecosystem services or ecosystem services or tourism, which are a natural heritage in Latin America. Like, for example, protected areas, natural parks. How are we going to measure this? How do we do this? So I think that we have a little bit of a challenge because I think that we have maybe to break some paradigms that we have been working on, because many times we are trying to adjust our to measurement systems that are not very clear. There is a very clear scope that we have to work on, which is everything that has to do with the issuance of green and blue bonds. We are also working on ocean and coastline ecosystems. And I think that the metric has to help us. How is that we are really going to assure that the underlying value of these bonds is correct, that we are not including things that are not green, quote unquote, but at the end of the day, how is that these finance projects have been done mainly focusing on the mitigation? And I think that this transition is necessary nowadays. And I think that it's quite interesting that the OECD and with all these dialogues, we can help or we can work on our reflection, because many times the hindrances that we are imposing on ourselves are not helping us, because sometimes it goes, but what is green? Well, green could be everything in adaptation, in ecosystems. So I wanted to share with you reflections because we obviously are following the methodologies in our case of the group of banks, but also international, very stringent methodologies so that our systems are rigorous and stringent. But sometimes we find out that these methodologies have not given the leap that they need, because it's complicated and maybe we have to think in some different envelopes of what we would like to do. So the leap to adaptation and have better nature-based solutions in order to face climate change should make us or compel us to do a different reflection, which is going to be translated with a different dialogue in the country. And so thank you very much for having me, and I'm quite pleased to participate in this debate. I'm available for questions and comments. Thank you very much.
Alicia, muchas gracias. And I'm so pleased that you raised both the topic of adaptation and biodiversity. There were actually two major themes that emerged from the Forum on Green Finance and Investment. To be really fair, for a decade, the work of the Green Finance and Investment team and, I'd say across the world was focusing more on the mitigation side. And it's a very important point. I myself am managing a new project on biodiversity and financial sector. It's a topic I'm very closely looking at, and you raised some of the measurement challenges. There is existing measurement, but it's very complex, and you can measure impacts and dependency, but the risk-based approach is missing. And then I think on adaptation, very fair point that we need to mainstream it beyond the policy and public realm into the decision-making process of private sector. And sometimes there's also a gap with metrics for resilience, and it's a much more diffuse than a unique carbon footprint metric. So however more complex, we need to address it. So thank you so much for raising it. I hope we can discuss that further in the panel discussion. Maybe Alicia, I want to ask you to bear in mind is when thinking about the role of development banks, where do you see the specific role that development banks can play on emerging themes like biodiversity and adaptation, using certain types of instruments versus the more mainstream instruments for example, clean energy. So anyway, maybe you want to think about it a little bit, and we'll come back to in the panel discussion. But I want to turn now to Paul. So Paul, you're lead specialist and acting practice manager for environment, natural resources, and the blue economy at the World Bank. It's a pleasure to have you. And so I'm turning to you now for your opening remarks. So please, Paul, the floor is yours. And I understand you may have some slides to share.
Thanks very much, Geraldine. I don't have slides, but as I'm going to say in my remarks, we recently launched a roadmap for climate action. And with your permission, I could post a link in the chat so as everybody can access that. I'll do that when I finish my remarks, if that's okay. Yeah, so last fiscal year, the World Bank provided about $4.7 billion for climate in the LAC region. And it was about 45% of our total lending in the region. And to help guide our engagement for really transformative climate action in the region, it was just in September that we launched this roadmap for climate action. And I'll post the link, as I said, in the chat. This identifies opportunities to build resilience, to support the achievement of national mitigation targets, and to help ensure a just and equitable transition to low carbon economies. The roadmap also considers financial sector reforms for green growth, noting that how countries across LAC respond to their investment needs will be a major factor in whether they can actually deliver on their greenhouse gas reduction commitments. Importantly, for today's discussion, we estimate that public investment can only cover about a quarter of the estimated investment needs for climate action. And a small share of that will come from multilateral banks. The rest is required from private investors. And in that regard, green finance in LAC, while it grew significantly in recent years, and exceeded 1 billion over the last 5 years in Brazil, Chile, and Mexico, it falls far short of what is required to meet climate and environment objectives. And for that, the development of LAC's capital markets presents major opportunities to scale up investments in green projects. And the demand is strongly visible in market pricing. So to address the institutional barriers inside and outside the financial system that prevent the full development of green financial markets, there's a set of initiatives that can help achieve the region's climate action potential. And these are grouped around, first of all, fostering transparency, and that we've already heard mention of taxonomies. So one is the introducing sustainability taxonomies, labeling of economic activities, and advancing climate-related financial disclosure. The second major theme for addressing these barriers is building capacity in the financial sector, including by setting up national platforms on green finance and expanding the role of national development banks in providing green finance. And finally, an important theme is stimulating long-term investments in green and sustainable projects by issuing green bonds, which can help set a precedent for a country's public and private issuers. But overarching all of that, I think it's important to emphasize that in addition to those kind of initiatives in the finance sector, it's going to be important to increase the relative returns of green projects by the pricing of externalities, including through carbon pricing, reorienting subsidies for fossil fuels, and decreasing political risk through policies that encourage investment in low carbon development, by which I mean examples such as policies that allow feed-in tariffs for renewable energy. So many LAC countries have started to green their financial sector, and the World Bank's private sector arm, the IFC, has been supporting a green banking academy in the region, which provides specialized advice and training to accelerate banks' green transformation, strengthen their businesses, and enable them to contribute to a more sustainable world. The academy was launched in 2018, and since then it's trained over 5,000 bankers and facilitated more than $1 billion in climate loans. but new regulatory guidance and tools are needed to support the mobilization of private capital for climate-oriented activities. And as has been discussed, a key area of focus is the development of green taxonomies. And in that regard, the World Bank and the IFC are working in a number of countries across the region to support the development of green taxonomies. And we're also engaged with the LAC Forum of Environment Ministers, which has a working group on green taxonomies convened by UNEP, which is looking at building consensus around regional green taxonomy standards. I'd like to note that private issuers in regional markets, such as Brazil and Argentina, have begun to issue sustainability-linked bond instruments. And these hold a lot of promise for corporates to access new sources of finance, while allowing investors to benefit by holding issuers accountable for meeting green or sustainability-oriented performance targets. And of course, sovereigns can support the green debt capital market by issuing sovereign green bonds. This will help to build a green yield curve in local currencies and support green capital market issuance by corporates. And I'd like to highlight a very recent example, which is Uruguay's launch in September of their sovereign sustainability-linked bond framework, which has two key performance indicators. The first linked to forest coverage and the second to the greenhouse gas intensity of the economy, which are both targets within their NDC. I think finally, it's worth mentioning the role that carbon markets can play to narrow the capital gap for the low carbon transition. Global carbon markets grew by 20% in 2020, reaching 272 billion. And over 1/2 of NDCs reference the use of market mechanisms to reach their targets. Research indicates the potentially substantial benefits of emissions trading under Article 6, potentially reducing the cost of meeting climate commitments by 250 billion by 2030. But market mechanisms are required to facilitate this. And in this regard, the World Bank we're working on testing the concept of a climate warehouse for mitigation outcomes to underpin the development of a carbon market infrastructure at this pilot stage in Chile, Peru, and Costa Rica. And more generally, we're facilitating dialogue to help scale up carbon markets regionally into the broader global market. So those are my initial remarks, Geraldine, and I'm about to post a link to our roadmap for climate action, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Paul, for giving such a comprehensive review of the range of toolkit that is both at the disposal and the kind of priority list for policymakers, development banks. I think you've covered pretty much all from the range of enabling conditions with the need for setting more robust carbon prices, feed-in tariff like targeted incentives, to financial regulations, to working on the development finance institutions, to carbon markets. So thanks a lot. This is extremely comprehensive, and I must say personally, been following with extreme interest the World Bank's guidelines on the sovereign bonds emission, including in relation to nature and climate. So congratulations on the work that Fiona Stewart and the World Bank is leading there. So this is a range of very great issues covered by our panel right now. I do want to open the floor for a panel discussion with the audience. And I do have some questions I want to follow up on some of the panelists. But while we do that, could I ask for the screen slide with the questions for discussion to be put back? Thank you so much. And maybe just encourage everyone listening to us to either turn your video or not, and feel free to raise your hands to ask any question. And then in the meanwhile, I'm turning to the panelists to see how they want to react to some of the questions for discussion, but also let me add my own. Is Ruben in particular, I was very interested by the range of tools that you presented, from the green bonds to the grants, and I was curious if you could tell us a little bit more about how you see the role of blended finance because, you know, the $1 trillion question is really at the back of my mind in today's session, and to leverage scarce public finance, you know, how can development financial assistance be used to leverage private funding? So I think blended finance is definitely a tool that at the OECD we've been carefully interested in. So Ruben, if you don't mind, that'd be very interesting to hear from you, and then maybe I'll turn to other panelists for some follow-up questions. Thanks, Ruben.
Thank you, Geraldine. If you don't mind, I will switch to Spanish now.
Of course, please.
Bueno, las finanzas combinadas o blended
Well,
finance.
blended finances are quite important because from our perspective of the Development Bank, we see it as a tool to transfer better financial conditions to the end beneficiary. Because at the end of the day, we are interested on having, for example, for climate projects, specifically for those that are involved in the private sector, and which require this blended financing, we need to translate those conditions to the end beneficiary. And this can be done by separating our balance, our general balance, or balance sheet from that financing. So at the financial level, to say it in some way, we manage the resources. Blended finance is done when we are not acting as on lending. We are not assuming the risk and then we translate it from the same bank balance, but we manage resources, for example, of the GCF or any other facilities. We have also a facility with Korea, with the Republic of Korea. We also have other facilities with the adaptation funds. So if we manage it in that way, financial conditions go to a deeper level, and the blending of the resources from the other partner or whoever partner we have is given on a lower level or a lower floor, in which improves the conditions for the end beneficiary along these lines. So at the management administration acting as trustees or in the bond emissions by using investments, 10G investors that are interested in the green bonds or the climate impact or the green impact in general, that is the view or the perspective that we are approaching, trying to translate the conditions towards the end beneficiary because we are interested in them. And as Alicia was mentioning, one of the challenges is how to measure adaptation. Adaptation is quite complicated to measure because there is a very fine line between something that is development and something that is specifically related to climate. So at the end of the day, what we would like to do is to increase resilience of people. But how are we going to measure this? So at the end of the day, what we are looking forward to having is not to have lots of layers where resources become more and more expensive at the end of the pyramid, but to try to prevent that overcost. That's why we use the blended finance in BCIE. And mainly at the private financing level, this is very important because how are we going to attract private actors or stakeholders? How are we going to attract financial institutions? How are we going to attract at the corporate level by translating to these better conditions so that we are able to create an ecosystem that is more attractive for the private stakeholders when financing or supporting and giving resources for these climate change initiatives. I mean, at the end of the day, the goal is to support the climate initiative does not become a huge effort for the private stakeholder, but to help them, we, like for example, the Development Bank with technical assistance, with guarantees or whatever other mechanisms, so that the private stakeholder is interested in doing it, and hence they can start up that business and that they incorporate it in their core business. If they incorporate it in the core business, the private stakeholder would like to continue, and hence the bank is going to reapply. They are going to continue supporting the initiatives, and we will achieve a better mobilization, because that's the goal at the end of the day. If we do not involve the private sector, we are not going to reach the climate goals of the Paris Agreement. We know that there is a fiscal limit in the country, so we need to involve more the private sector.
Thank you, Ruben. This is so comprehensive and interesting. Thanks a lot. You said amongst many other valid points, the challenge to measure adaptation. And I think it's really a critical point that when trying to understand what's missing here, I mean, I think we can agree on some net zero challenges and methodologies and the commitment to action, the greenwashing risk, but I think on adaptation, the metrics are very cruelly lacking. I think this echoes very nicely a point that Alicia was making earlier. So Alicia, maybe I want to turn to you if you want to react to what Ruben just said on the complexity of adaptation and what's the role of development banks, specifically on the issue of resilience and adaptation, to try to leverage private sector involvement there to the extent possible with all the challenges that Ruben just highlighted.
Muchas gracias. Y ha sido muy interesante.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting. What he said and what Paul said was very interesting. Now, I couldn't agree more with Ruben. We share very similar visions and challenges. How can we do to mobilize more private investment? Well, I think that, as has been said, adaptation was seen as an expense for cooperation for development rather than seeing it as an investment. So economists' work here is essential. How can you help for all of these projects? We are all speaking from our point of view of our office, but then you have to talk with the country and open a dialogue with them, and you have to show that these are profitable operations for the public sector and the private sector as well, so that they contribute to start large projects, like large infrastructure projects that are resilient, that need intervention or participation of the private sector, and that in many cases are being financed through private windows. And we have to really work to demonstrate all the benefits of resilience and future savings and energy investments. Sometimes, to me, it is really difficult to separate mitigation from adaptation, which is another ongoing debate. For example, regarding energy, if you talk about hydroelectrical power, then mitigation, yes, but adaptation as well, because climate change impacts are affecting very much many countries, like Paraguay, for example, who are getting a lot of impact in their hydroelectric power generation. So we really have to work on the side of showing all the economic benefits of resilient projects. This is a field where we need to work a lot more, because sometimes we must remember who are the speakers, at least for multilateral institutions, and you have to remember that it's the departments and ministries of financing and development who are the ones participating in the dialogue, who are the speakers in this dialogue, and those that express the issues regarding climate change, loss of biodiversity, etc. It's in the ministries of the environment. So we need to find tools that will allow us to look at climate issues in terms of profitability for the public sector and the private sector, undoubtedly. And one more comment, if I may. Regarding the private sector, we have a huge challenge, and I would like to hear what you have to say. And this is about lines of credits with local banks, because they are a very powerful instrument that can help transformation in certain sector, working with SMEs regarding energy efficiency and green projects. And it's complicated to track those lines, but they are necessary. And this is clearly the private sector participating, but it's also complicated when it comes to taxonomy. So how can we qualify them? I like to hear to colleagues because tracking may be difficult and we may be missing important information, and we are missing an opportunity to mobilize financing through those lines of credits because of this lack of capacity to track what's going on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And I find that you just raised in your last point on energy efficiency and the issue of local bands, a critical issue, which is that there's a mutual incentive to do energy efficiency. I mean, in terms of financial returns, it's an obvious win-win for everyone. And yet, like you said, the key challenge is usually to get the credit lines and the credit subsidization throughout the local banks. I must say, without knowing, you know, like experiences in Latin America, in Europe, for example, KfW in Germany had a really successful experience 10 years ago in trying to mainstream the credit subsidization across commercial local banks. You know, and even though sometimes it may have some crowding out effect, still the success story on energy efficiency in Germany is, I think, quite compelling. So thanks a lot. There's a lot we want to discuss. I think Rodolfo has his hands up. So Rodolfo, the floor is yours.
Gracias, Geraldine.
Thank you very much, Geraldine. So basically just to talk about the example Dr. Douglas mentioned about the needs in vulnerable countries that depend on tourism and other activities that developed under different climate scenarios that are no longer the ones we're living under and are not in the future. And hopefully also Mexicans participating here want to raise their hands because Mexico has suffered from hurricanes in Cancun and Cabos, and hotels are rebuilt using exactly the same materials at the exact same location and with the exact same vulnerabilities they had when the hurricanes raised them over. So you must also think about a reorganization of supply chains to supply food and the supply of other tourism services that are associated to hotels. And the reactivation of the economy after a hurricane as fast as possible is a highly profitable investment. It is highly profitable. And this should be seen as business, not as an assurance system in the financial sector, because it's not insurance that should be responding, in my opinion. It's not insurance that should be responding, but we should have readaptation and reconvention projects for this key infrastructure. So as Alicia said, taxonomies are missing. They have a gap of these projects that could happen during or after an extreme weather event. And it's the same with events that post-pandemic events in the health sector to adjust the health sector to face new pandemics. And it's the same here, how to adjust an economy to face new climate scenarios. I see Kirk raised his hand, so I'd rather give him the floor rather than keep on talking.
Thank you so much, Rodolfo. And actually, I see Kirk has his hands up, and it's very timely to react to your intervention on the issue of building better. I know we had that topic of building back better after COVID, but it's the same topic of resilience of real estate. So Kirk, the floor is yours to maybe give your perspective from the Caribbean region.
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much, Rodolfo, for stimulating my mind and thinking of what I want to share. So first, I would say that adaptation for climate and also mitigation from climate for climate cannot be separated. I think they're both in tandem, and I think it's just semantics. I think at the core, what we really want to achieve in terms of the intent is that we want to make people's lives and livelihoods better or more secure. I believe that that's the fundamental intent. And so I think that we have to pair climate adaptation, climate mitigation with other national development problems because of the fact that within Latin America, within the Caribbean, in terms of the government expenditure, in terms of the finances that we have available, every dollar that is spent within this region has to go a lot further than it would in other jurisdictions because of the scale of the economies in terms of the type of revenue that we generate. So I just wanted to make that first point. And I also think there's a skewed or bias towards certain types of renewable energy, which within our context, within Latin America and the Caribbean, I think we have to be very careful of. There's a lot of emphasis on renewable energy as it relates to solar, as it relates to maybe even hydroelectric power. But these are also very, very vulnerable to climate change impacts. Particularly within the Caribbean, we will affix solar panels on our roofs. But these roofs and these structures are very vulnerable to hurricanes, severe weather systems that can come along and damage this infrastructure. And then we're still at the same stage that we were. So we have to think in terms of financing for climate resilience, in terms of renewable energy. What is perhaps the better alternative for renewable energy for our region? I'm not saying solar should be totally out of the door, nor hydroelectric power, but I believe that the biological sources of renewable energy in terms of bioenergy have to take a greater precedence in the conversation as it relates to climate financing than it is already doing. I'll give you an example for Barbados. One thing that we are proposing to the government of Barbados is that we have a problem and a challenge being due to our smallness as small and developing states. We have a waste problem. So while we are looking at fixing the climate mitigation, the climate adaptation, we still have several issues of wastewater, of food waste, of green waste, of in terms of the electric vehicles, because a lot of conversation is going on, but we're not really looking at the product life cycle of a lot of these interventions. So when solar panels, and they do have an end of their life cycle, what are you going to do? How are you going to manage this waste? Electric vehicles, the same thing with these larger lithium batteries. You have very small nations with very limited capacity in terms of dealing and handling waste. What are your plans in addition to just fixing this in the here and now? You have to look in terms of longevity. So when you think or speak of sustainability, how sustainable are those interventions really in a long-term view in terms of 20, 25 years, 30 years? Are they as sustainable as if you're taking your waste and then converting that into energy and converting it into economic products that can then stimulate national and regional development? So I want to kind of guide the conversation in that way, because that, I think, is the key for building back better for Latin America and also for the Caribbean. Why? Because this has the opportunity to stimulate the generation of jobs. I'm not talking about just in terms of numerically the type of job, but I'm talking about high quality, highly paid jobs for skilled workers. And that is a conversation that we need within the Caribbean. We have a problem where people emigrate from the Caribbean because they're skilled, they have upskilled, they've gained their education, but then there's a brain drain. They emigrate to other regions to then support those other economies. But we need to harness the economic, the intellectual prowess of people that we're training, because we're spending a lot of money in education. And I know I'm going in diverse areas because we can't only look at climate change mitigation and adaptation in isolation. We have to look at national development, and these are what the development banks like IADB, the IDB, that is really where their concern is in terms of the holistic development of countries. And if we are serious about it, we have to look at climate mitigation and climate adaptation as part and parcel of that entire national development. It cannot be segmented in isolated on its own, or not we won't achieve what it really or the potential that it really has. For instance, if we can take the waste in Barbados, all of this waste, and we do a biodigester, anaerobic digestion, we can generate biomethane. We have challenges on the island as it relates to the high cost of petrol. We have one of the highest cost of gasoline in the entire world for a very small country, 166 square miles. And that is because obviously of gas prices around the oil prices around the world. And these inflationary impacts in terms of the economic shocks will continue. And so we have to find ways of adapting and also mitigating against those economic shocks so that we can continue to go along that economic the economic growth rate that we have. But if we do not examine this in a holistic way, we will continue to be short-sighted, myopic in the way we implement things, and we will continue to be retarded in terms of the economic growth whenever these impacts come along. We can improve health. We can also reduce the cost of living. These are very critical points that all countries within Latin America and the Caribbean face to different extremes and to different ranges. But these are also concerns even within communities. People are interested in social mobility, of moving from one area in terms of the social economic status to another. How do you do that? And how do you do that in a sustainable way? So I think in terms of the green funding, I think it would be important for development banks to not only look at climate mitigation, but look at what this intervention, how this can also impact in other sectors. For instance, I mentioned the anaerobic digestion, you'll generate carbon dioxide. But that may seem like something negative, but actually that can actually be an asset, an economic asset. You can convert carbon dioxide by cleaning it as a medical gas. You can also convert it into beverages for carbonated drinks. The other thing that is really interesting is that you can convert carbon dioxide into cement. So when you think of infrastructural projects that come through these development banks, and you have a country that is now trapping or storing their carbon dioxide in their infrastructure, perhaps they should get concessional rates. And these are the types of innovative funding and climate financing that I think we need to take a look at.
Definitely, and thanks a lot, Kirk, for raising the need for a holistic approach. I think at the OECD we couldn't agree more. And just to highlight that at the OECD we very closely look at the climate lens through a well-being approach to try to bridge climate between the broader human well-being, social, economic development. It's absolutely critical, like you said, to make a compelling narrative, including to mobilize private sector investment. And I think some of your points of addressing mitigation and adaptation together, but also addressing climate, broadly speaking, with other goals is so critical, avoiding trade-offs, addressing synergies. And, when you were talking about renewable energy, I couldn't help but thinking also about trade-offs with biodiversity, which is sometimes an issue that is completely neglected. And Paul mentioned earlier the boom of carbon markets. I mean, carbon markets should entirely be integrated with possible trade-off and synergies with biodiversity as an example, but I think that's one of many of a holistic approach. Okay, so I think David will from the US has his hands up, but while I'll give the floor to David, I would like panelists to think about a question from the audience. Are there differences in working with players in the financial sectors of the country's bank, insurers, stock markets, etc.? So David, I'm turning to you, and then I'll ask the panel to react to that question from the floor. Then maybe we'll move to the issue of transition plan specifically. So David, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Many thanks, Geraldine. I don't seem to have a video. It's not open on your side, so I will just continue with voice and in Spanish if I may. Y yo solo para concordar con gran parte de los comentarios de Kirk Douglas.
I agree with many of the comments from Kirk Douglas and Rodolfo regarding the importance of visualizing everything through a lens of a circular water economy, where water and wastes and sanitation are seen as a whole. When it comes to investment, there are signs of maturity regarding to instruments and actors that can work under the public-private investment method that they can handle the whole cycle of water, from production at the sources with water funds, channeling resources to forest protectors for water recharge to ensure water supply in the future.
Thank you
When
so
it
much.
comes to a scarce resource with an overexploitation of water resources, both surface water and phreatic water, the topic of loss reduction is already showing signs with new technologies that can be used by a public company that lacks the resources to reduce losses, which can be of up to 40 or 50% in a water supply network. But you can use innovative contracts like performance contracts, like one in Bahamas, where a private company is providing the service to reduce losses at a high cost. But financing resources that can come from the outside can help decrease the cost of those contracts. And then waste to energy is another important topic, to turn waste into an important resource, which has good results for mitigation and adaptation. And doing this job is very important in order to manage water resources as a whole.
Thank you so much, David. Very, very important points. And I must say that the water nexus is also something that is probably neglected in the climate world right now. But at least I try to build more bridges between climate and biodiversity, but I think we have a full team at the OECD working on water. And sometimes we think that it's a little too disjointed. So thanks a lot for raising that. Okay, so I want to turn maybe to Paul and offer you to either pick up on the question from the audience in the chat on the different players in the financial sector, or if you prefer the third question on the issue of credibility of corporate transition plan, because one thing that is critical is that there's a lot of commitments, and but translating it into credible transition plans, either from a financial sector perspective or corporate perspective, is something that the World Bank, I'm sure, is very closely looking at. So, Paul, I don't know if you want to react to either question, but I'll pass the floor to you.
Sure, thanks, Geraldine. I've been looking at that question from Roberto about whether there are differences between working with banks, insurers, and financial markets. I mean, the World Bank and the IFC are engaged with all of those actors in Latin America on questions around green and climate finance. And I'm scratching my head a bit about whether there are significant differences between them. I mean, we've seen both with public sector banks and private sector banks real interest in developing taxonomies and also in developing green bonds and other financial instruments. We're working with financial sector regulators in, for example, Argentina to help set up guidelines about what would be ESG certifications for different market instruments. I guess that, I mean, the obvious difference is that the more you are working with private sector, the more important it is to demonstrate the returns and the risks involved with the investments. And on the public sector side, it's more to do with how do you best capture the transparency that's required to help with meeting public policy objectives. So perhaps that's the main difference. But I mean, fundamentally, we're seeing interest from all of these actors in working on climate finance. And perhaps the most important thing to say is that it's important to engage with all of these actors in the financial sector, which make up a whole financial ecosystem to support climate finance. So one shouldn't we're not focusing on one or the other. Our engagement is across the board with all these public and private financial sector institutions. Turning to the last question on your set of questions for the panel, how to make sure that corporate commitments are not just greenwashing. I mean, how do you know it's not greenwashing? Ultimately, you know it's not greenwashing if the corporate commitment is based on real concerns about returns and risks, right? If it's simply based on a concern to promote brand, then there's always going to be a question around the extent to which is greenwashing. If it's based on a real consideration of returns and risks, then the question of greenwashing doesn't really enter into the equation. And this is where I get back to the point I made during my remarks that we can do a lot to try and increase the supply of green and climate finance and meet the demand and promote the demand. But ultimately, what we need to be reached, and I see this as a transitional phase, and where we need to be heading is to increase the returns of green projects and reduce the risks associated with them. And that comes through adjusting the pricing, reorienting subsidies, and establishing policies that reduce the political risk of green and climate finance investments.
Thank you so much, Paul. Lots of insights here. I see, Alicia, you were nodding when Paul was speaking and you have your hands up. So I want to turn to you. We're running close to the end of the session. I think there's a lot to cover, but Alicia, I want to turn to you to react to what was said and also maybe give you final closing points on that session. I think there's so much to cover here that we deserve more than just the hour we've been spending, but it's definitely been such a good discussion.
No, perdón, no quería adelantarme.
I didn't want to jump ahead. I can speak later. I'd rather, I was reacting at some of Paul's comments, but I can wait if it's okay.
Please go, Alicia, because we're almost out of time. So please go ahead. Thank you.
No, muchas gracias. Yo creo que...
Thank you very much. I believe that this reflection on how to attract the private sector, I think that at the end of the day, it transcends the debate because maybe the private investor can know a lot about these topics, and sustainability is now in the heart of large companies, but they see it as business, not as commitment. Maybe both, but it's important for them to look at it as business. So at the end of the day, we need regulatory frameworks that are very clear, and that depends on the countries. Companies look at predictability, not just climate finance and other things that we are talking about, but they focus on their investment. If I invest, then environmental impact issues will be respected. No regulatory changes that suddenly say that there is a huge, big change or a total change in the commitments made. We have to look at this from a more general perspective, and I must insist that we have to transcend these lines that we have set ourselves, like mitigation, adaptation, disasters, and talk about consistent regulatory frameworks, consistent with the ecosystem, consistent with the use of natural resources and environmental assets, because at the end of the day, investors will be completely confused, and the point is that the countries will assume a commitment for transition or resilience, and that frameworks are clear, straightforward, with no changes. Investments in things that are related to climate should not be substantially different from any other type of investments, because all investments should be consistent with climate objectives. That's what I wanted to say. I believe that we have to look at transition as a new productive model encompassing everything, no different in conditions to other types of investments to attract investment. Thank you very much.
Alicia, thank you so much. I think you just gave a perfect closing remark for the entire session on the need for a systemic approach to the transition and make it kind of a business as usual. I must say, it's about time that the transition framework activity is not just the small scale and that it's mainstream across development finance, across government's policy, across private sectors thinking from a financial risk perspective and opportunities. And I'd say it echoes very nicely some of the points that the entire panel has said. I must say thank you all to the panelists joining me today. It's been a very rich discussion. It highlights the breadth of the challenge in terms of the diversity of tools, the diversity of approach, the need for both granularity, metrics and adaptation, but also the need for a holistic approach that goes just beyond the narrow lens of climate. The need for having a diverse set of tools to private sector mobilization. And I think the need to not forget that it's not just the financial sector, but also the enabling policies, the need to strengthen carbon price, incentives, align disincentives, etc. So thank you all so very much. I think we will stop here. And I want to thank you all for listening. Thank very much my panelists. And Eya, the floor is back to you. Thank you all.
Thank you very much, Geraldine, for your excellent moderation. It's always good to have you around. And thank you, of course, to all panelists. I think it was very interesting discussion. But now we move to hear what Rodolfo wants to say as key messages from this discussion. So, Rodolfo, the floor is yours.
Muchas gracias, Ella. Gracias tanto a Rafael como a Geraldine.
Thank you very much, Ella. Thank you, Rafael and Geraldine, for moderating these two sessions on climate financing. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I think that you have provided us a comprehensive view of the whole spectrum of different aspects that we need to take into consideration from the financial system in order to do what, in a very proper manner in Spanish, Alicia Montalvo said, how to provide vitality and transparency to financial operations, climate financial operations that are key and dominating in the support to projects for energy transition and transition to carbon neutrality or carbon neutral. We also heard that in Latin America, we have a pending agenda. The World Bank, for example, very clearly told us that there is a roadmap. There is a route that we follow. We have been supporting precisely the reconversion of the sector through an academy so that you can use the guidelines, the instruments to create the necessary taxonomy for the region in order to be able to allocate the resources and to mobilize them in a more expedite manner. It is also true that, as Sandra mentioned, Sebastian and Kirk mentioned, that we need to have or to hold a global vision and to put the sustainable development goal always in mind as a final goal to reach. And for this, we have the classical channels of the three axes or the three topics of the framework convention, which is mitigation, adaptation, and financing. But it is necessary to start merging all those agendas with a new dynamic, that should not confuse, as Alicia mentioned, the investors, of those that are making decisions in the financial sector, but on the contrary, to provide them with certainty elements, less risks, more predictability, and obviously better or more flows are going to be allocated for the projects that we need. there is one item that drew my attention specifically because all the multilateral banks who participated today with us and the financial analysts think that it is important. I mean, they are mobilizing a very good part of their resources, but they see that it is important to innovate, to be creative, to provide an underlying value to green bonds, to blue bonds, to create businesses that in some way can face the issue of lack of jobs or lack of income, and that can root the population so that they are not migrating because they are better educated or because they are being impacted by the weather, in order to create the necessary wealth so that we can have feasibility and a future for our countries. There are many details, and we will send them to you obviously later, because the issue that we analyzed currently should give us the solutions themselves, how to manage these credits or these resources, how to make of them very expedite mechanisms so that they can be accessed, that we meet all the requirements, yes, but to expedite the money distribution for those that are in need of them, specifically for the adaptation actions that are quite urgent to address, but with a vision to renew development systems and schemes effectively in a progressive manner. And in the next decade, our countries are going to be developing the regulatory frameworks in order to create that necessary envelope in the financial system in order to act with certainty. But it is important, and with this I will conclude, it is very important for all of the instruments, all the stakeholders of the financial system are included in this dynamic that we were talking about today. We need to work with a silo, if we work with a silo approach, we are not going to attain this comprehensiveness that we need. 3 topics were important here and stress out, like for example, water, to have a circular economy in the islands, but also speaking about the sectors, specifically speaking about the sectors that have to do with the environment, water, biodiversity, natural resources management, etc. I mean, these aspects were highlighted. This concept of creating biomethane fuels with the waste that tourism is creating and importing to the islands. This is a way to create a circular economy by decreasing the dependence on fossil fuels. I think that this is a very important part to mitigate, but also to adapt and to improve the basic infrastructure in our countries. There were quite interesting comments regarding the Caribbean region. Once again, they are the most vulnerable, those that have to be addressed in a very faster manner. This is a social demand, that this is also a humanitarian demand. I think that under these new climate conditions that we are experiencing and living, we have to set some priorities with these features that sometimes are moral ones, ethical ones. They are not part of the business of some financial agents, but these decisions that are ethical decisions should be taken when we are facing climate situations that are beyond the risks. And with this, I conclude, and I give back Aja the floor to talk about tomorrow. Thank you very much to all of you for your participation today and for your patience. Thank you very much.
Por invitarnos a participar y enhorabuena a todos.
Thank you very much for your invitation and good luck to all of you. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure. See
Thank you
Goodbye.
very much. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rodolfo, for your summary. I just want to say that we continue tomorrow. We will start at 3 o'clock and we will focus on technology transfer, and hope you will be able to join the discussion, and would like to wish everybody a good afternoon and good evening. Thank you very much. See you tomorrow.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.